It's the conversation. It's the conversation. Y'all ready? Y'all ready? Let's go. Let's go. No filter, no restrictions. You about to get my opinion in its purest form. So my words, don't try to spin them. What I said is what I said. And what I said, I meant it. The gloves are off now when I'm coming out swinging. So engage in verbal combat, but you better be ready. Cause this here for me is light work, even if the topic's heavy. I'm ready for it all with no running from nothing. You just take the time to digest what I put in, no rushing. But time is moving, don't waste it. You want the real, come and face it. Come sit and talk to me if you want it straight without a chaser. And it might burn a little when you step on up to taste it. But it's nothing harsh, I promise. Just a little conversation.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the conversation with Harold and Dave. Welcome our guest today from My Perspective Friday, Larry Edwards, here to talk. He's been dying to get on this show because he wants to talk politics and government, but of course on his show we don't talk politics and government. So he tries very hard to worm it in there every time. Sometimes he gets us, and we have to cut him off, and sometimes he's not successful. But welcome here, Larry.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes, we won't bring up the Denver Broncos now.
Hey, wait a minute. No, that's just cold. I don't care.
Don't worry, we won't bring up the Pittsburgh Steelers either. So,
I don't follow hockey, so it doesn't matter.
You don't follow women's tennis? All right, Dave. So today we're talking.
No, those people, I know. Because you get a name. And I'm like, oh, Venus won. I understand who that is.
One person. That's like beach volleyball too. You know?
Oh my God, Dave just proved he's an elitist. So Dave's an elitist. We have not taken.
No. I watched the Tour de France. You want elitist crap right there? That's the one sporting event I follow is the Tour de France. So there we go.
Hey, you know what?
Well, if I'm.
Harold, your audio's going in and out. It's buzzing. Uh-oh. Go ahead, say something. Oh, okay. So you're all elitist. All right.
That's normal, though. No, Kentucky Derby's, yeah.
All right. So today we're talking about protesting. Does it work? Why it matters? Does it accomplish anything? Because there's a lot of views on protesting, and we know the narratives, whether in a good way or bad way, with protesting. So I just want to get a conversation with you all on that. I know this is a hot topic for some and not for others. So my first question is, protesting doesn't matter. We're going to start with the simplest question. And what's your thoughts on that, Dave?
Well, I can't see how that, is possible. I mean, I can see why you'd be skeptical of it achieving desired ends, right? Mm-hmm. But I was driving from New Jersey, and Crosby, Stills, and Nash comes on, and it's Tin Soldiers and Nixon coming, right? And 4 Dead in Ohio, right? And as I'm listening to the song, I'm like, well, this is an impact because this comes from protests and the violence at protests. And so, I was thinking, I think we're going to talk about this. And here's one thing I'll point out is, wow, this is woven in there. And so I think that in that sense, protests are part of our political discussion. They're part of what we would call discourse, but it's a discourse of action. Mm-hmm. And people do stuff in them, and it makes a difference, right? In the sense that it draws attention to issues and it brings it part of the narrative. Now, does it, did the protests end Vietnam? Like, if we go back to there, mm-hmm. The other side of it that you would question whether or not they did any good comes from the fact that, Nixon at one point said he believed there was a silent majority that supported him. And although today, in retrospect, no one thinks they were part of that. Of course, most people weren't alive then now. But they, the polls at the time, like 60, they asked, Black poll asked, hey, do you think you're part of that silent majority? 60% said yes, which would be, last time I checked, a majority. And So I think though that nevertheless, what the protests raised the heat, brought the issue out, and I think the government moved. They moved the goalposts. They said, peace with dignity, and the narrative became about how we're going to get out. So I think in that broad context, they're one factor in many, and so I can't say they don't do any good. It's hard to come up with a protest where you say we are protesting, we make this demand, and you immediately get it, except for very minor things. So, but that's my initial thought here.
Okay.
Well, first of all, if you brought up Vietnam, there was no peace with dignity because we gave up and left. We quit. That wasn't peace with dignity. We gave up. And the protests during Vietnam, you gotta think back at what that really did to the morale of the country. You had, I'm going to say, the minority of the country was out there protesting, destroying property. People got killed during that. You mentioned I believe it was the 4 people at Kent State University you were talking about.
Yes.
All right. They got killed doing what they were doing. Most of those people that were protesting were of college-age people. Not all of them, but most. And they were instigated by people like Timothy Leary, who called himself a doctor, who promoted drug usage. Now, that was not the only cause of what was going on. But then you got somebody like Nixon, who was I don't even want to get into Nixon, but either way, that stuff with Vietnam, again, somebody that was there, I was there. Again, we did not leave with dignity.
Well, one thing I didn't say that was Nixon's policy.
We have not had dignity in any war that we have had since that time. And that's because the politicians and jerk-offs like Nixon were controlling what we've had ever since.
Well, peace with dignity was Nixon's policy that he was pursuing. Not saying that I never said we had peace with dignity. And so Nixon, though, that was his thing of he tried to move and put it in a context of ending the war under, and a large part of the final resolution of it came down to negotiations about the return of POWs. And so my point is that as far as, the protests are not all Timothy Leary. I mean, there was definitely a counterculture. But, it's hard to say that, the Veterans Against Peace, I believe it was John Kerry was part of that. And
Veterans Against Peace? Is that what you said?
Veterans Against the War, I believe.
Oh, okay. All right.
And John Kerry was part of that. And so, there were a lot of people who did those things. And I think, though, that the point is that a lot of that casts a shadow. And whether or not, and the thing is, what's interesting about the protests is they can have effects, right? You can look at a protest and one group of people will see one thing in it. Right? Certainly Black Lives Matter, right? There are very different views about what those protests mean and what they represent based on what side you take, right? And so they can actually they can be very much a double-edged sword, which complicates understanding exactly what they achieve. They do something because they move the discussion in a direction. Whether it's in the intended direction is, perhaps a question, but discussions kind of take on a life of their own sometimes.
Correct. We've seen that recently with certain things. Somebody protests something in a certain way, and someone can change the narrative of why they're actually protesting, and then people run with that. And we already know what I'm talking about without even saying it. Harold, what are your thoughts? Mhm. No,
No,
he
no, no,
no,
no, no, no. I'm going
he
to
was
say, Errol, I'm going to say that I agree with you 100% on that. I do. I agree with
hold
you.
on, Larry, because there's a but. Hold
No,
on.
no, 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 no. I agree. If somebody's got a problem, you have your right to voice that opinion. But I agree with Harold. You do not have a right to go out and disrupt other people that have nothing to do with what you're protesting.
Well, they do, but I'm going to get into that in a second. Go, Harold. Oh, hold on. Hold on. Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead. You were breaking up.
Well,
Hold on, Harold. Harold, hold on, because your audio's going out. We got the part up until one group of protesting. Check your text. I'm going to have you try to join on your phone because the iPad audio is getting static, but we got most of what you were saying. I was saying something to that effect before where and then people are saying they can't hear you. So we can hear you, but they're chatting that they can't hear you. So try to join on your phone. I'm in agreement with Harold up to that same point of I'd rather people protest and not hinder my day or cause disruption. But then I'm also saying is when they do that, that's how most things get noticed. I was in DC. I was trying to go to the Museum of Science or one of those museums, and I couldn't get out of my parking lot because somebody was protesting something. I had no idea what they were protesting. And my first instinct was to be upset because I wanted to go to the museum. But then I started looking around and find out what they were protesting for. And when I realized what they were protesting for, I was like, why don't I know about this? I was like, holy crap. And in that instance, I was like, you know what? This trip to the museum is a lot less significant than what these people out here are talking about. And sometimes when people are inconvenienced, it seems like that's when most things happen. And what's an inconvenience? Dave, I could tell you the sit ins at the diners were an inconvenience to people who wanted to just come in and have a meal, right? But what did that change? Well, what did that change? So it's the big it's the fine line of protesting. I'm of the opinion, and I say opinion because it's not a fact of I don't want to tell people how they should protest. I think that's the whole point of protesting. And when someone's protesting, it usually tells me there's a whole bunch of things that have been done previously that were ignored or not answered. Dave?
Well, and I think that's a good point that if we go to protests that I think you really could say were the other set of protests that I think were really important were the civil rights movement, right? And John Lewis and everyone who crossed that bridge in Selma and Rosa Parks. And I mean, we have names. And I teach at a university that's just very intimately involved with those two folks and those actions, and because you're near Montgomery, and Troy is also now home to the Rosa Parks Museum. But the thing is that
I'm laughing because you told us the Rosa Parks Museum, but then I remember you telling us the building that's like near it or next to it. Some building you were saying that was up about. I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, I don't know that one. The point though is that those protests, and the point about it is that the people who were were standing up had no alternative, right? The protests were really the only alternative available to them because they were disenfranchised, they were oppressed, and they were not being seen, and they were not being heard, and so. Protests are your chance to get out and get around that. And while, so this is a major function of them that if you say, well, we have ways of dealing with problems, and we do. Do they always work? And does everyone have equal access to those corridors, those channels of decision making? Perhaps not. Almost certainly not. It's ridiculous to ever pretend in any system anywhere everyone would have perfectly equal access to things because
right.
Not without it being designed against it. It's just logically there will always be someone who's mismatched. And protests there are a back channel, another channel, and that's an important function, right? There has to be an outlet. There has to be a way for people to say, "Hey, this is a huge problem for us. We're suffering. We need this." Often making it inconvenient for other people is part of getting attention. Very often making it inconvenient for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Rosa Parks she protested, but she got arrested. She's practiced civil disobedience, and that can be a way to where you say, I may be just one person, but look what I'm willing to do. And if we move outside the United States. Mohamed Bouazizi, who goes down to the market downtown in Tunisia and sets himself on fire, right?
Uh-huh.
Setting off the Arab Spring protests.
Well, that's an inconvenience to yourself, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was we have a lot of these events. Those events occur throughout. Immolating is actually, there are a number of cases where people have done that, to bring and to say, look at this. This is an issue. I care this much about. Pay attention. And,
I want to say something to you, and I have a question for Larry. It was something that you said earlier in your statement, and not that you were saying this, it just jogged my thought. I feel like people who are on the side of what the protest is trying to protect are the ones that are told it's easy to tell them to be patient while you're on the other side not being affected about what they're protesting about. Like, for instance, if women are protesting against something that affects them, it's easy for me as a male to say, "Hey, it'll change. You don't need like it's going to take time, might 3 or 4 years, but you don't need the protest." But when you're on the side that's being affected, it's a little different, and I feel like that's why people protest. Larry, now something, and I'm not saying this is why you have like the views on protesting that you have. I know you served at Vietnam, and we all know what happened to Vietnam soldiers when people who served in Vietnam when they came back. I don't know if that plays a role, and you can tell us for yourself into your views on protesting, because I would like when I came back from Iraq, that wasn't it. I don't know if my mindset would be the same if I came back from Iraq and people were throwing trash on me and yelling and screaming at me and spitting and all those things. So is that a part of the effect of how you view protesting, or does that have little to do with it?
No, it's got a lot to do with it. Back at that time, it was, in all seriousness, it was almost easier to go back or stay than it was to come back and put up with that bullshit. I came from Southern California at the time, and I actually did 3 tours, and out of 4 years, I probably spent 3 or 4 months back in the States because it was easier to deal with the stuff over there, and yes, that very heavily affected my opinions of protesting. But I agree that there are some things that needed to be changed and take a long time to change. But we talk about inconveniencing people by trying to make change, but everybody's skirting the issue of that inconvenience is really causing property destruction and costing people their lives. And we're not talking about peaceful protests. We're talking about destruction of property. And that is a major inconvenience.
Well, you know what's also a major inconvenience? It's the one thing that I talk about. It's like when I talk about the anger of people of the kneeling of the flag, and I would always say, why aren't you as angry on why the flag is being kneeled on as you are kneeling? So no one wants, and what we're all talking about here is we don't want people to go out and protest and burn buildings and shoot people and things like that to happen. Those things have happened. There's many stories, whether you want to take it, whether they're people that are being planted, instigators, whatever names you want to call them. And I'm not saying one life is greater than the other. Normally in the protests that these things are happening, because there's been a loss of life previously that no one has cared about.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody care about the loss of life during these protests? Because I don't see anybody protesting the violence during the protests. I don't see anybody protesting some of these people, and I use that term loosely, like Kaepernick, that started kneeling during the national anthem, denigrating the flag and the national anthem for something that he was personally interested in doing, which he did. He didn't do it on his own time. He did it during the national anthem, and he could do it during a football game if he chose to. He could have knelt in the middle of a play and got all the attention in the world.
He would have got it.
He chose to do it during the national anthem.
Larry, what you just said shows why he did it. If he knelt during a regular play, no one would care. I have said this on many of our shows. Kaepernick was kneeling for weeks. No one cared. No one paid attention until he was asked the question by a reporter, why are you kneeling? And then he gave the reason, and then everyone cared. Marshawn Lynch sat in Buffalo, sat in Seattle during the national anthem for most of his career, and no one
Nobody said anything.
one word about it. It was when it was placed. That's the thing we got to look at. It was when it was placed on why he was kneeling. Then there was outrage. No one's out here outraged that people are on their cell phones during the national anthem or eating their hot dog or talking during the national anthem, players picking their nose during the national anthem. But as soon as someone said I was kneeling because of the disproportionate violence against minorities from police officers, then all hell broke loose. If he did it on his own time, no one would care. That's my point. Not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just pointing out that if he did it on his own time, nobody would give a damn.
There are other ways to do it, and I'm not saying that people would care if he did it during the middle of a play. I use that as an example.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm just saying you do not denigrate the national anthem or the flag. That's
Why not?
all I'm saying. I happen
not?
to be. Why not?
Well,
Yeah, why not?
Can I-
Why don't you do that? Don't you have the freedom to do what you want in this country? If you want to talk about what the anthem is about, what it's about, don't you have the right to do that? You're asserting a prohibition that does not exist in our country. And this is something that's always bothered me about, this debate, is that somebody here is kneeling, and kneeling is not a sign of disrespect. He's not
It's a sign of
flipping
indifference.
off the flag. He's taking a knee and saying, in a moment that is supposed to be rife with symbolic value, because you are listening to the national anthem, which is why you do it there, not during the game. It's about symbolism in the first place. And so if this is how he chooses to express himself, I don't understand how that isn't just part of this whole thing we got here in the country and what we defend and what's important about the place. And, so I mean, he's not burning the flag. He's not flipping it off. He's not being overtly disrespectful. He's exercising the very rights that we're talking about. And if we don't defend the right then when do we defend it?
Well, I'm trying to think of a way to format this next question, without offending you or anybody else. But
while you're pondering, Larry, let me go ahead and assert something really quickly to give even more context to the Kaepernick situation. He initially was sitting, as John Keone alluded to, and it was a military veteran,
Green Beret,
that suggested to him, rather than sit,
because that's
to
disrespectful.
take one knee. Now, we all know, those of us, myself being a Christian and going to church, we tend to take a knee when we pray. And who are we praying to? That higher power, that God, that person that we have seen. And we're doing it in a fashion of humility. Now, if you're looking at it on the outside as to what purpose I'm kneeling in Kaepernick's situation and saying, well, he shouldn't be kneeling at all, even in standing, you've had Muslim athletes who would turn their back to the flag during the national anthem. Some were blackballed in the NBA for doing that. Craig Hodges, Ahmad, and I forget his last name, but he was Chris Jackson at LSU. So, but my point is him taking the advice of a military veteran to do that, and then him explaining as to what his real purpose was for doing it. And one of the things I've often said is, no one's complaining that the concession stands are open during the national anthem and people are buying alcohol. Now, if this is a sacred time, then let's make it sacred. Why isn't anyone telling the owners, say, hey, listen, you need to shut down the concessions while the national anthem is playing? But that's not happening. People are getting whatever they want to get, and so I think the energy that was pointed toward Kaepernick, it was later on that the NFL had to admit, not openly, but they've admitted on a number of occasions very subtly that they were wrong in how they handled the Kaepernick situation.
They
And
were
that
wrong
he
in a
was-
lot of things. But
Yeah.
let me ask you something. Now you're saying or implying that Kaepernick was possibly kneeling to pray to
didn't say that.
God.
No, no,
I
no,
didn't say he was
I
praying.
said implied. I said implied. That's all I said. Was
no,
implied.
no, no, no.
I didn't say he was praying though.
No, he
I
was,
said when I kneel in
Yeah.
church,
yeah,
I'm praying to God.
he was saying
Okay,
what
all
he
right.
was feeling.
Then I misunderstood.
Go
Kaepernick
ahead.
was feeling because he was told that because it is a sign of indifference. That's why in sports anytime you go to speak in sports, in the Army, when you walk up and you just want to have a conversation, it's so easy to say, take a knee. Everybody take a knee, listen up. It's a sign of indifference. And veterans argue about this. We saw veterans with hat that says Veterans for Kaepernick, and we saw veterans who were, you don't do that to the flag. I fought for this country, but I'm one of those veterans that's exactly why I fought. It's what Dave was alluding to. There's a saying that goes this: everyone loves freedom of speech if you're speaking things they want to hear. Everyone loves freedoms of rights as long as you do those freedoms in the way that they see fit. So it's a constitution protected right. Dave, I'll let you elaborate on that. What you were alluding to when you were, if you can expand upon it, on why him kneeling during the flag is something that shouldn't have been viewed the way it was viewed. I know I just screwed that up because I was trying to get it the way you said it, but I could never say it the way you say it. That's why you're the
I don't know. I
professional.
don't know. It shouldn't have been viewed. I mean, personally, my reaction to it was he's kneeling, right? And I just think of things recently in the protests in Iran. A bunch of schoolgirls took off their hijabs and they had their picture taken, flipping off the photo of Ayatollah Khomeini in the room. Now that is openly disrespectful, and I think Kaepernick's and the whole kneeling during the anthem thing is about, it's a yes but. I think they are not, and that's part of what I kind of felt I was reading into what he was doing, was that he's not saying, I don't see it denigrating the flag. I see it as raising a yes, but we have a problem I want to draw attention to. And that is an exercise of freedom of speech. And like I say, I don't know that I always felt it was a very mild one, right? And like, that he chose this. And so, and like I say, I just find it deeply ironic that people who, that the exercise of freedom would be seen as being unpatriotic, because, well, what's the point? Right?
Well, the narrative was hijacked, and we know the president at the time also hijacked the narrative. My confusion is always when someone's protesting, whether it's Kaepernick or anybody, someone's protesting. A reporter comes up and asks them why they're protesting. They tell you exactly why they're protesting, and then you have a bunch of outlets that go way to the left side or right side or whatever of why they're giving you their words from their mouth on why they're protesting, and then all these things are made up about why they're protesting and what they're doing. That's the thing that always baffles me.
It does come back, it does get, it's in that rough spot that we've got that I think is very endemic and very much a characteristic of the whole debate, is you have a lot of people who really, really want to have a positive view of the country, that it's part of their identity, that these are truths and values that they are really looking to be enduring, right? America is good, right? And my initial reaction when Donald Trump was like, "Make America great again," I'm like, "Hey, asshole, we've been great. The only thing not great around here is you, and you can take a hike." I've been teaching soldiers. They're great. They've been great. They're greater than anyone has ever. They're in a long line of unbroken greatness. MFer. That was my reaction. But you see, I'm invested. I want America to be great, and I do think it is great. However, to say that it's perfect, and especially if you aren't this color, right, it's not so great. Quite frankly, we really can look back at a whole bunch of wild ass horrible stuff that happened to people and is still happening. And so there's this problem of how do you express the admiration for the country, the commitment to the overarching values, the aspirational values of America, while drawing attention to how we're falling short, right? And that no, if anyone can do that, they're going to be president, because it might not be possible, right? Because it gets so, but it's certainly not possible if people are back and forth, on it, but because political parties have an interest in polarizing to get people out. But this is the problem I have, just in general in life, right? Because I go through this. I'm a former soldier. I like the country. My family came here on one of the first boats. Other than like the people are already here, but
we're not gonna get into that.
Yeah. We try not to talk about them in my family. But that's the point, though, is how do we deal with the pilgrims without recognizing names? And yet somehow it works, and I think there's a lot of good to be in there. And America does have very good aspirational qualities, and very good institutional qualities, freedom. There are a lot of great things there, and you're better off living here than anywhere else. Well, OECD countries, like it's good to live in Canada and the Netherlands too. But when you talk about folks, right, there's a lot that goes into it. So, it is a good place even if you're not in the 1%, right? And so there's a lot of good to be said, but at the same time, we got to have our eyes open about it.
Well, if you make a criticism about the country, you're already deemed unpatriotic. Like you can't point out faults of your own country without being deemed unpatriotic. What they used to do back in the 80s, they just call you a communist if you had a disagreement with.
They did in the 60s too.
He's a commie. You can't have. You can be patriot. I mean, the most patriotic people criticize the place where they live because they see the flaws, and they're not pointing it out to downgrade their country. They're pointing it out so those things can be fixed. Am I wrong?
That is,
somewhat, yeah.
I'm somewhat wrong or somewhat right?
Somewhat wrong, which means that you're somewhat right too, but that's another issue.
Expand
on
that.
Did I may have misunderstood you, but did I hear you say that this country is not so good unless you're white?
I think, for a lot of history, that was not the case. For a lot of our history, I know that I respond very differently to a police officer pulling me over. I come from a long line of college educated people who went to Dartmouth and and so I think there are a lot of things. Now, are all white people privileged? I don't know. I'm saying it's different. There are distinct disadvantages. African Americans absolutely, were there, and it's fun reading the old. It's not fun for this. In reading the old Perry Mason, at one point I started reading the original Perry Mason novels, and one thing that was a bit irksome in there is the casual racism. And a phrase that was repeated many times in the novel was, "I'm free, I'm white, and I'm over 21. I'll do what I goddamn well want." At the end. And so there has been a long-standing advantage in this country that I think I've been. Now, at the same time, it's a country that's institutions have worked against it, right? That have worked to, end slavery, and to eventually, after a backsliding, to have a civil rights movement. Now John Lewis and a lot of folks had to fight. They had to put a lot of skin in the game. But it's had the seeds to get better, right? And to correct those things. But as an objective fact, there are great racial disparities in wealth, security, and just about so many things in our country.
I've lived in the South all my life. I do tell, but it is different. And you notice though, being aware of the difference, like when people try to ignore the differences, like I am well aware of the advantages of being a man in this country versus being a woman. I'm very aware of it. And so I don't get upset when someone says you have a certain privilege because you're a male, just like when someone says you have a certain privilege when you're this. There's a hierarchy of uh, privilege in this country. It's sad that at the bottom of that hierarchy is minority women. I know I'm above minority women. That's not saying it with proudness. That's saying as a sad fact that I have a priority over them. And saying that is your awareness. And then now you have the awareness. How do we fix it? I've been pulled over many times by a police officer. When I start speaking, you can see the relaxation in their face as if, what did you think I was going to sound like when I got out of this car? You know, but you don't notice those things if you're not a woman or if you're not a minority. You may not notice these things, or some people choose not to notice these things. You know,
You know, I've been doing something along those lines. Not pulling over black motorists, but I've been in dealing with folks. You know, when I grew up by New York, right? And back when it was really actually dangerous to go to New York City, right? And
You mean it's not now?
it is not. No, it is not. New York City is very safe. They have a
Really?
very low crime rate, and
Yeah.
you go into New York City, and I walk from Port Authority to Times Square. I don't recognize the place. It's like frickin' Disneyland. I mean, it's palpable
it's such
how
a
much more secure you are. And it's amazing.
Hey, hold on a second, Dave. You said that. I went to New York about 5 years ago, and I had all of the images from New York growing up and hearing stories and seeing things. So when I went on the subway, I was always looking around like I'm going to get stabbed every 2 seconds or someone's going to offer me drugs. And as I was going from borough to borough, I was like, what's all the hoop? It's 2 in the morning. I haven't gotten stabbed yet. You know?
It's crazy. But one thing we were taught, though, the thing is, don't make eye contact. Don't make eye contact, right? So you go through life not making eye contact, trying to distance yourself from folks. And that, you know, and honestly, you know, the guys we think are going to, again, if you look like me, the guys you think are going to bust you are probably African American, right? So, you know, even though it was never said that way, and certainly, by the way, you know, there were plenty of other folks, you know, but you kind of had that view, right? And one thing that I've said is like, well, what does that effect have, right? And is that right? And so one thing I've noticed is I've talked to people, and kind of that moment when the cop relaxes, I go through that is when I pass a black person on the street. I kind of talk to him, you know, I just am like, hey, how's it go? You know, I'm like really kind of cloyingly friendly now. And I almost get that stutter, like they look at me and go, oh, hey, how's it going? You know, and I don't know if you have that experience of being invisible to white people. I've heard that that's an issue, but I've had a lot of success just blatantly violating that old rule of don't make eye contact. It's like, no, make eye contact. Say something nice and prove you didn't vote for Trump.
Oh my God. Yeah, because there's an assumption. Larry said it before the show. Just because someone's white doesn't mean they voted for Trump, but we talk about narratives and stereotypes. Harold, I want you to comment on this. Now I remember what I was going to say when you were talking earlier, Dave, and now that I elongated my question, I forgot it again. So Harold, go ahead. Oh no, I remember. So I grew up listening to stories of my uncles and that grew up in Mississippi and Georgia, and they would tell me, you know, they would get arrested for something that they were nowhere near because they fit the description. It was always they fit the description. It was a black guy in a black shirt, right? They would get arrested, and when they would go and talk to the public defender, they had 2 options. Hey, plead guilty because you'll get a lighter sentence. If you don't plead guilty, you're going to be found guilty. That was basically the sense when you were black in the South and you were arrested. So you had a lot of them just pleading guilty because of the alternative. They're going to be found guilty anyway. I'm saying that to kind of point out to people that that's a part of the thing Dave was saying when he says if you went through America at certain periods, it was a greater risk of looking like this than looking like that, because that wouldn't happen to Dave when he was arrested in Mississippi and went to court. But that's not the privilege that my grandfather and his friends were given in Mississippi when they were arrested. And it could be something you did, Dave, and you get a lighter sentence over something they didn't do, you know? So and if anybody who scoffs at that, you obviously don't know your history, or you don't pay attention. All that material is out there and statistics are searchable. Harold, you were trying to interject earlier.
Yeah, I was actually going to look at pivoting back to the original premise, when we talked about, talking about protesting and, what we've learned in recent years. Hello? Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Uh-oh. My phone battery just went down, so I might be getting thrown off in a minute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. But what I wanted to say, and I know my phone battery is almost dead, so it'll probably kick me off in about 3-4 minutes, but I'm going to make this quick. When we look at protesting, also what we saw, even when we go back to just the 2020 election, black women protested against some of the things and unveiled their strength in the voting booth, which led to the change or the loss of Donald Trump and converting two Republican senators from the state of Georgia to Democrat, making those seats Democrat. So when we look at protests, we talk about what goes on in the streets. We talk about taking a knee, but we also, I think sometimes we take for granted what happens in the ballot box or in the voting booth, so to speak. So I think, pivoting back to where we were at the beginning of this is when we look at the need for protesting. There's so many different forms and so many different ways. Some will grant and give a lot of attention or receive a lot of attention. Others will be done subtly, but if you go back and analyze it, have an even greater impact. So at the end of the day, I want to encourage us as well as the people that are viewing to look at all the different forms of protesting. Look at all the different ways it can be accomplished, but more importantly, understand why there was a need for the protest so that you make sure you're on the right side of that situation and not just out there just because you want to be a part of the crowd, so to speak. Because back in the day, I recall, we talked about the destructive protests or some of the destruction that happened during 2020. Before I talk about the summer of 2020, I want to go back and let's revisit the red summer of 1919. But many don't want to do that. So, when I look at what happened in 2020, there's a lot that I agreed with. There's a lot that I disagreed with. But at the end of the day, I understand certain people during those protests had a different level of frustration. And although they expressed it differently, the key here is trying to understand the true premise as to why we are where we are, because certain things continue to happen that were ignored. And with that said, gentlemen, I know my phone's going to cut off.
No problem.
So I do apologize, but I'll stay on as long as it allows me.
No, you're fine. We're 5 minutes from Dave's Ukraine update anyway. So my question is...
Dave's Ukraine update! Really, I shouldn't be happy about
be
this.
excited. I was just going to say, wow,
joy.
did you just celebrate that? That's what I was just about to say.
I celebrate getting to talk about it because I'm here home alone with my wife and 2 dogs that I don't get to talk about much.
No, I got you, Dave. So my question is, we talked about does protesting matter, but we've seen throughout history the changes protesting has made. I always say the changes that have come after a protest aren't talked about enough. So it's like the results, almost like it's like having a football game, but you hide the results, right? But what was the point of watching the football game if the results get hidden? And so a lot of times when no one goes back over what policies were changed, And the only way people sometimes know those policies are changed when they see an act that's named after the person that's involved with the protest, like the George Floyd Act or something of that nature. So, Dave, what do you have to say to people, anyone out there who just says protesting is a waste of time? It doesn't matter. All it is disruptive. What's the point of doing it?
Well, and I don't want to, go too far against what Larry's talking about. I mean, Larry has expressed a frustration with the destructiveness,
Yes.
and we were touching on that goes in there.
Yeah.
That there are destructive moments there in various of the BLM protests. You get people in that either want to be more violent. God, the WTO. At the WTO conferences, the protesters used to set up zones where you could pick the level of disobedience / violence you wanted to engage in. And so, like, if you were an American steel worker who just wanted to hold the sign and peacefully protest, you went over there. If you were an anarchist, you went over on the other side. And that is always a problem where people are coming out and the people who are doing the violence are engaging in the activity as a cathartic, expression of themselves, as opposed to people who are like, no, we're going to do this protest and we're going to affect change, right? And not for nothing, Martin Luther King and Gandhi were massive nonviolent advocates, right? Because they knew the second violence occurred on their side, they would lose momentum. And so they controlled the message. Both Gandhi and MLK controlled the message and were crafting something that would be acceptable to people. So I think, there is that I think we have not really addressed enough. That goes to what Larry doesn't like about it, about these violences. And honestly, with BLM, I've seen a lack of, when they talked about the whole defund police thing, right? That was a phrase that sounded good, but maybe you could have changed that to be more palatable to the audience. And there was like, we're not going to change to make it palatable. It's like, well, do you want to have progress, or do you want to give the other side a talking point, right? And I understand where you want to keep your the protests and not to be second guessed and to keep it authentic, but you're giving up political efficacy. And Martin Luther King and Gandhi would have absolutely been like, well, what's a better way of putting that? And so that's an aspect that I do think we've
Harold's always good at pointing out the difference between an organization and a movement. And a lot of people don't understand that's the different sides, right? You have a movement, and then there's an organization that's formed that's in the movement, but the movement is always bigger than the organization, right? The cause. And it's just my concern, and I'm always going to go back to my concern, is we're all in agreement. Burning down buildings, destroying property, and people getting a loss of life has no place in a protest. We know it happens. I'm always going to be a person like, why are we at this point? But there's too many people that don't want to focus on that. They're like, oh my God, they burned a building. Yes, the loss of life is the thing that buildings can be rebuilt. Not saying, again, I want you to burn down a building. Loss of lives, a life is lost, a life is lost. You can't get that life back. That's the biggest terrible part of this whole thing. But you also got to care about, well, why the hell did we get to this point? And not enough people, no, I'm not going to say not enough people. There's too many people that don't care about how we got to the point. They just care that the building was burned down.
Yeah. Well, and I think the question is, are you trying to reach out to other people to draw attention and win hearts and minds? Or are you trying with the movement to change yourselves and to express things and to assert things? And, some movements are introspective and Nation of Islam never gave a damn about what other people thought, right? They were about changing their own community, and they were about transforming themselves and being independent, whereas Martin Luther King was more about reaching out and getting, and eventually the win is the civil rights movement. Because if you win, you're going to be co-opted by your message, and your demands are going to be internalized by the normal political system, as if it was their own idea that they had all along.
Yeah, that part.
And that's a win, though.
Look what we did. We changed this. No, you changed this after 2 years of bloody protest, and now you've changed it because, it's one of those things. I just wish people would care about the matters more. And people who think, well, I'm not a part of this. Everyone's a part of it, whether you think you're a part of it or not. Silence is agreement, they always say.
Well, look, we keep, I think, skirting around a big part of the issue. We keep talking now civil rights. Now that was protesting. I think that was one of the issues where that was legitimate. That was something that needed to change. I think there were positive issues that came out of that. Unfortunately, there were violence that happened because of it. And again, unfortunately, most of the violence was caused by white people. I agree with that. You had black people and you had white people that did a lot of positive things. Again, Martin Luther King. You had John Kennedy, who supported the civil rights, did a lot of good things to help it along. You've had some crackpots that tried to go against it. I can't think of the guy. I'm going to say the white guy that from who was the governor.
Wallace.
George Wallace. That's right. You talk about a crackpot. That was one of them. He is somebody that deserved everything he got. You had people on the other side of the fence that have made their careers and their livings out of keeping racism alive. And I'm going to use. I'm serious. I'm going to use Al Sharpton.
You can't, Larry. You can't keep something alive that doesn't want to be alive. That's
yes, you can.
No, you can't. No,
there's a couple of people that are doing that.
No,
they're making a living off of they're making a living off of doing that.
Oh, God.
And you could disagree.
It's not a disagreement. It's like when somebody tells me, when they try to give me a history lesson about slavery, and they go, well, black people in Africa sold black people. And I always look at them and go, well, you can't sell anything no one's buying. You can't sell racism if no one's buying it. Trying to fight for a lot of people think because you point out racism in an institution or institutional racism, you're keeping race alive. And they always go, why are you bringing up race? Well, I'm bringing up race because it's a damn factor in what's happening. And that's coming from the people who are in that skin tone are telling you that these institutional racism things are happening. So I am not always in agreement with Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, just like Dave isn't in agreement with everyone who looks like them. But what I'm not going to do is badmouth someone who's done more in a pinky for the betterment of people who look like me than I've done in my entire life.
Who would that be? Who would that be?
You name two of them, okay? They've done more for black people in their pinky than I have done in my entire life. Doesn't mean I'm in agreement with everything or every method or when they show up and why they show up, but I'm just not going to die on that hill because I've done not one iota of what they have done. A lot of the things that I'm able to do today is because of people that you are naming, okay? That's number one. And when you say the civil rights movement was legitimate, it takes away the legitimacy of the others, of the other things. No one protests because everything's going great.
No, I'm saying civil rights was the legitimate reason.
Oh, I got you. Well, give me an illegitimate one.
An illegitimate one?
Yeah, an illegitimate protest.
How about what just happened in Atlanta?
Well, enlighten us.
What was legitimate about that? What are they protesting against a police training center?
Is that what they were protesting? A police training center?
I'm asking you.
No, I don't know. You brought it up. I said enlighten us because I don't know what
Well,
You're talking about the protester who was shot, and then
the one that shot the police in the stomach, and then he was killed because he did it. You talking about that
he was
one?
shot at too.
Well, he shot at the police. Then they shot him, and he was killed. And then there was all the protests in downtown Atlanta, and then they were spray painting all at the Stop the Police City, which is that training center outside of town. Now I'm asking
I'm
you.
going to tell you this, Larry.
Is that wrong?
I'm going to tell you what I've been trying to tell you for 3 months. When there's a protest, it's 9 times out of 10 not even about that specific issue. It's a bubbling point, and something happens, and then the water cup overflows. Like the riots in Los Angeles after Rodney King. They didn't protest just because those 4 cops got off because they beat the hell out of Rodney King. There was a bunch of people that had been brutalized for so long, and that was the drop that filled over. Now, I can't comment on that specific one because I'm not going to sit here and disagree with you having done no research on the matter. Dave seems like he knows more about what you're talking about than I do.
Well, I don't know. And I'm waiting for them to find out what the hell happened with that.
Oh, you mean in Atlanta? Is that one you're talking about?
Yeah, that one is the thing.
All I know is that little bit about it. Now, what you're talking about in Los Angeles or in Rodney King, I actually lived out there at the time. But that's an old issue, and quite honestly,
it's not an old issue.
No, I agree with you on most of that. I do.
It goes back to 1619, actually, but
it's not an old issue. It's still happening.
We're not getting into that 1619 project. I mean, my God. But no, I agree with you. There was a lot of racism going on in Los Angeles at that time, out in the Watts area. All of that. I lived out there then. In Atlanta, this latest issue, that is what I know about it. Now, if I'm wrong, somebody just tell me. That's all.
I gotta do research. I don't know the issue. All I put is you told me he shot a policeman in the stomach, and then he got shot.
Yeah, well, that's all I've heard about it. Now, if I'm wrong, the next time we do something, you let me know.
Right. I
appreciate it
because the blip I saw was Go ahead. Dave.
To say that protests can be good doesn't mean that all are good.
Correct.
Right? It doesn't mean that there aren't riots. Right. I think they call a lot of things that aren't riots, but there are riots, and there are people that loot, and there are sometimes things that are bad.
Those tag-alongs are always going to be there. These people that eject themselves that aren't there for the cause. That's been happening in protests since the beginning of time. They just go to the protests and do what they want to do. And I can't allow those people to dictate the narrative of what the protest was for.
Well, sure. Now, we'll go back to Atlanta. The 6 people that were arrested, they were charged with terrorism for what do they call it, local terrorism or something like that.
That's amazing how fast that happens, and it's taken like 2 years to charge like one person with terrorism from January 6th. That goes back to that thing Dave's talking about. Like,
what happened on January 6th was wrong. Every one of them people that I wish they could get every single one of them people and lock them up because what they did was wrong. I believe that the 6 people that were arrested in Atlanta, 5 of them lived out of state. These weren't local people that lived there. They had nothing to do with it. And again, if you got better information, let me know what it is. These were people that came there just to get pissed off and piss off everybody else.
Yeah, that's all.
It had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, that's always going to happen. But I don't have this anger and disdain in my face because I know that's not what the protest was for. I can't let you can't.
What was it for?
You can't let. I'm speaking in general because this always happens. Not always, but mostly in protests. The violence in the protests, 9 times out of 10, has been proven not to be the people who are out there trying to do the protest. The people aren't sitting in their room going, "Hey, let's protest today," and Dave burn down Dave's shop. They have an agenda of what they want to do and achieve by that protest, and then you have people that join in and don't, or people who get away from what the intent is, because people are people. That's not justifying it and saying it's right, but I'm not going to let those people deter and take away the narrative and why the protest is actually happening. That's all I'm saying. Let's get into
And I'd like to know what the reason was for the protests.
I don't know for that one. I'm speaking in protest in general.
Okay, and I don't know what it is either.
If you don't, well, we got to wait for the information then. So we can't rail on something that we don't have the information about.
All right,
You know what
I
I
can
mean?
live with that.
Yeah, that's like if I saw a news thing, Larry's arrested for domestic dispute. I know Larry. I'm like, wait a minute, what? Do I jump on here and just go, Larry's a this and this? I was like, wait, let me get the facts. See what happened.
Oh, hey, just a second. This is the VA.
All right, let's get into Dave's. Let's get into Dave's Ukraine update.
Well, and like I say, I shouldn't be so excited to talk about Ukraine because it's very serious things. But a lot of the news lately has been dominated by the tank tussle, as I call it, and we've just recently heard that Germany is going to be sending some Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, and a coalition of nations or people are coming out and offering up Leopards. Germany sold Leopard 2 tanks to a lot of people. So there are a lot of people out there with them that are talking about donating them to Ukraine. The United States is going to give 50 Abrams, so that's good. The key thing is that we're seeing this upgrade. We're seeing Bradley fighting vehicles, Marder fighting vehicles, tanks, strikers, where, the Ukrainians are being given much more mobile firepower that they can integrate with the artillery that we've been giving them. That's the thing that's been going on. And when you combine it all together, you get what's called combined arms. And that's the kind of stuff that they do at Fort Irwin, at the National Training Center, and at Grafenwehr, where we are now training. We're rotating Ukrainian battalions through to get training. So those battalions, as they come out of Ukraine, are going to be potent fighters. What we are looking at now, where things stand, Russia is getting through its mobilization. It looks like Putin is now putting his house in order. He has put his head guy, it's kind of like he took his equivalent of the chairman of Joint Chiefs, General Gerasimov, and he's made him the overall commander over Ukraine. And we're seeing a marginalization. It looks like we may be seeing the beginning of a marginalization of Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner group, right? And kind of a sense that it's a little speculative, but ISW has been looking at it, and they just recently had an update talking about that where we had this big competition with Putin seeming to favor Yevgeny Prigozhin and his mercenaries from Wagner over his Ministry of Defense, his actual military people. It seems like that ground has shifted, and Prigozhin didn't take Bakhmut, and they used a lot of troops to take Soledar. So they're seeing the Ministry of Defense kind of coming up in favor, and also all those troops they mobilized are starting to get trained, right? So they're starting to have some trained troops, and it looks like they're going to have some forces to apply. And the question is, where are they going to do it? Are they going to invade through Belarus, or more likely, are they going to come in through Luhansk and try to envelop, come in behind the Ukrainians at Bakhmut and take over Donetsk? Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are getting all this cool hardware, and they are looking to blunt this offensive. The Ukrainians are talking about Russians having an offensive, and the Ukrainians are getting this stuff. So we're really going through the winter with a lot of fighting over Bakhmut, with the Ukrainians upgunning, the Russians starting to put their house in order, and it kind of looks like sometime in the spring we are going to see, and where that is, we don't know right now, right? But for now, Bakhmut continues to be the center of all fighting, and the Russians are making very, very minimal glacial progress around it, and nothing significant's likely to happen there. So we're really kind of waiting for the game to change, right? And it's kind of interesting to be waiting for a game changer, but that's pretty much where we are right now. Any questions? Or am I alone now?
So,
Okay.
no, you were alone, but we are here now. I always love, and it's so funny. I'm not trying to say love like I love the situation. I feel like the information I get from you and the breakdown and the way you talk about it helps me understand what's going on in Ukraine a lot more than when I'm trying to catch up on the news. I try very hard not to watch the news as much as looking up things myself because I just feel that everything is so much more. And it may have always been that way. Maybe I was just a kid and didn't understand it, but I hate how everything is narrative driven. Like we're gonna pound this narrative into your head until you believe our narrative, which stops people from thinking for themselves and trying to understand and break down. I never have a strong stance, and which is funny, Dave, because when you're going to school, especially college, what do they always make you do in a lot of cases? Make an argument for and against this subject, right? So, like, one of the things I had to do, I had to make an argument for and against affirmative action. So, as a black man, I'm making an argument for affirmative action. That was the easy part. So, the hard part was me making the argument against it, but I had to make one. And then when you start making the argument against it, and I'm starting to do them, I'm like, wait a minute, I actually agree with that. Oh crap, I'm not supposed to agree with that. So it's the very weird thing, and I think people, no matter what topic they're thinking about, should force themselves to make it like guns. If you have a stance on guns, make yourself make an argument being pro guns and make yourself an argument being anti guns. That's what I try to do with situations.
That's funny because you mentioned my academic point of view on this. It's political science is a social science, and so we actually don't like the for and against thing. Although we will, that's a mechanism to get people to consider both sides. But we try to push through to say, all right, here, come up with a theory to explain something. That theory suggests a hypothesis, and you test the hypothesis because it's not he said, she said. We're trying to find out which is right. And so that is often something like in our research classes, I'm trying to say, look, it's not about an argument. It's about, can you devise a test? Now my phone is going off. Sorry, I didn't.
Well, at least it's not yelling that it's going to whoop somebody's ass after I accuse you of being violent. I accuse him of being violent, and then his song says it's going to whoop somebody's ass. So I'm like, okay, well.
But anyway.
But Dave, I was saying that because I feel like for me, that helps me understand why someone would be making this opposing argument. It's why I disagree with Larry on the protesting, but I understand some of his frustration from protesting being what he experienced himself. It's almost the same, which is not funny, but it's almost the same thing as I'm protesting certain things that are because I'm black, because of things that I've seen or ways I've been treated because of being black, is why I'm in agreement with some of these protests. It's almost like the same thing. But it's not look like this. I mean, I could help being a soldier. I'm the one who voluntarily joined. I didn't volunteer to be black.
Well, and I volunteered to go in the military too, but I'm not against protesting just because I'm white.
No,
I'm against protesting because I'm human.
No, that's not what. Well, I don't know what that means, but that's not what I'm saying. But I don't know what that means.
Okay, so no questions about Ukraine. Okay.
Well, let me ask you something, Dave.
Trying to get on. Oh my God.
All
right, Ukraine.
With Ukraine, do you think we need to send troops over there?
Oh no, we would never need to. Although, I think we would end this with F-35s. And this is a war that, and when we look at Russia, I often have been saying is Russia has been in a good position in that we have been self-regulating, right? We're very reluctant to go over this tank threshold, right? But we did. And Russia's thing, though, is they say, we will destroy those tanks. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, they're tanks. You're in a war. I expect you're going to try. From what I've seen, you're better at blowing up apartment buildings, but go, do your best with it. The point is, though, that we aren't saying to Russia, hey, you need to knock it off, or we're going to start giving tanks, or we're going to start giving F-16s. We have not, that's what I mean about being one-sided in the deterrence thing. We have not been, the U.S. and NATO, leveraging that. Like, we're the ones afraid of Russia escalating. And Russia really should be much more afraid of us escalating, because we have so many levels of escalation. And the day comes that we intervene, it'll be release the F-35s, and the Russian army will cease to exist, because they've got a Ukrainian army that's matched and can overmatch them. And if you add in that firepower that you would get from NATO, you can't fight it, without an air war. So. And so I really, in that sense, I don't know that NATO won't have to intervene at some point. Certainly, if Russia uses any nuclear weapons, that's likely to be the red line. But I think the bigger question in this war is, it's in the U.S. and NATO's interest not to let Ukraine fail. Is it in their interest, or is it a compelling interest for them? Is it worth very much for them to help Ukraine succeed, right? And Ukraine is now talking about getting Russia out of Crimea, right? And that's where they want to go. And all these tanks and this armor, that is, once they get a couple, probably 3 brigades, if they had 3 good brigades, they would probably be able to put maneuver on the battlefield around Crimea and get to it, get through Zaporizhia and Kherson province to Crimea. And then, it'll be over. And the question is, I always said the big problem the Ukrainians have is that we're on their side, but it doesn't mean our goals are their goals.
Right. Dave, you can comment on this. I feel like people say, why did it take so long? And this is talking about 8-9 months ago, for certain aid to be sent to Ukraine from certain countries in terms of arms and equipment. And I always say, I don't think everybody was had the same idea of Russia. This isn't going to last long. And so we had no one had any need to send aid, because they're like, why are we going to send all this? This is going to be over in a week or a month. A month was ridiculous at that time when this started. And now, I mean, how many days in are we?
Well, everybody thought that Russia was going to overrun them.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody thought that Ukraine was going to go in there and be as tough as they were. Now, unfortunately, they've got a military that's willing to do anything they've got to do to win.
Oh, and the civilians.
You're right. Now, you've got other countries, United States being one of them, that doesn't have the willpower to do that.
Well, it's not about the willpower. I think it's a little more than just the willpower.
Well, it's the politicians are running the military, and they don't have the balls to go in and do anything.
Oh, well, now, okay. Hold on now.
Well,
I get what you're saying, Larry.
Well,
the one thing that generals have, because they ain't got to go over there and die, is the balls to say, let's go.
No. That is true. But in the same sense, you've got people that are running this country, running the military, that have done nothing for decades but talk big. That's all they do is talk. And other countries like Russia, like China, and the rest of them know that we do nothing but talk. And they're not afraid.
Way more wars than any of these people you're talking about.
We've been in a lot, but we haven't done anything to win them. We have been in a lot. We get in everything that's going on out there, and we shouldn't do that.
What's your definition of win?
Go in there and kick some ass and win, like you were just talking about. Ukraine, that should have been over in a couple of weeks.
Whose ass was unkicked in Iraq and Afghanistan? I mean, once you get it, those countries are overwhelmed very quickly.
Do you think we won in Afghanistan?
Seriously? The war? You didn't win the counterinsurgency. You didn't. First of all, this expression of, oh, do you think we won? We fought for 20 years of counterinsurgency. We did not win that counterinsurgency because we failed to produce a viable Afghan government, just like we failed to produce a viable Vietnamese government, just like in a lot of situations we go. And so I think that, when we talk about these things, if you're talking about a war, right, then we're talking about the first phases of these things, which the U.S. clearly dominated. If you're talking about counterinsurgencies, right, we did not know. Clearly, the Taliban got back into power. But that's not because we failed to kick anyone's ass, right? It's because we did not, we had, we had a very bad partner, right?
There's wars within the war.
Yeah.
If we wanted to go into every war and just totally scorch earth and annihilation, we could do that. But
well, I mean, this is the thing: is that the kinds of wars we're seeing now are the wars the U.S. is able to, like in Ukraine, it's very much a war the U.S. with a backhanded effort would, be able to wipe out. But as far as occupying an area and making people happy about it, that's not there. China's the big military threat. China is a major threat. And is China, China hasn't fought a war since it fought Vietnam in the late 70s. And so, the Chinese don't have a lot of experience, and they've been watching the U.S. fight wars, rather rapidly since the end of the Cold War, from Grenada to Panama, just small wars escalating in size to Iraq to Kosovo. And, we've been kind of a very fighting group. And so I just don't understand what we haven't been doing. Right.
Yeah.
Iraq was, in the end, we more or less pulled it out,
I'm gonna say I was in Iraq, and I'm gonna tell you the conditions and standards of most people's living in Iraq is nowhere near what it is now. Yes, they have security problems, and they're running to a lot of problems that other countries are. But you got to remember, when you have a dictatorship, it's a lot harder for people to infiltrate than when you have a democracy, right? But the people, like the horror stories of people when I was over there telling about how they had to live and the punishments for certain things, like just, putting a satellite dish and sneaking in a satellite dish and watching channels you're not authorized could be caused by death. And over here in America, we have a hissy fit if our internet goes out for 30 minutes. We have a meltdown. So that's a W for me. That's why I said, what's the definition of winning? Did that war change the lives of the people that are in that country significantly, for the better or for the worse? If it's for the worse, it's an L for me. If it's for the better, it's a W for me.
Now, I would say it's about, are you achieving your objective? And, on that note, one of my issues with Afghanistan, well, first of all, you go into a war with an objective and things change, right? And so we shouldn't be shocked. People can call it mission creep. But, the question with Afghanistan is what was your goal in going in there, right? Your goal was to deny Al-Qaeda a safe haven, right? Because they had attacked us at 9/11. And it was very clearly a war of self-defense. It was a war the UN didn't even need to vote on. They just said, "Oh no, yeah, they attacked you. Go get them. Have a good day." And in fact, the UN passed resolutions condemning the Taliban for letting Al-Qaeda be in there. And so, at a certain level, it's like, all right, the Taliban's back in power, but for 20 years, you kept, you made sure there wasn't an Al-Qaeda base. And Al-Qaeda largely doesn't exist anymore. Now it's ISIS. And so, in a lot of ways, even with Afghanistan, the objectives you went in were largely achieved, right? And people say, oh, we encourage people if we pull out of Afghanistan. I kind of wonder, I said, sure, we left in the end, and it was ugly, and it was not a great, a good moment at all for the U.S. But at another level, I look at it and say, look, if you let, what's the lesson from Afghanistan? If you let somebody conduct a terrorist attack from the United States, we will come and we will get you. We might let you back in 20 years later. And, as a deterrent, that sounds not so bad.
Yeah.
Right?
Why
So-
go in? Why go in after the fact? What? You said if you come and attack us, then we'll go get you. Now you happen to know that groups like Al Qaeda, which is, by the way, back in power in Afghanistan again, not Al Qaeda or not ISIS, but Al Qaeda. You know that they're looking to come after the U.S. again. They've done it before, along with Saudi Arabia. They're back in power. Why sit back and wait for them to attack you again? Why not just eliminate them to begin with?
Because you're never going to eliminate them. What do you?
Well, I mean, why wait for them to attack you and then go after them after the fact?
Larry, if I got in a fight with you and beat you up, and then you came and defended yourself and beat me up, and I got arrested and went to jail, just because I got out of jail doesn't mean you need to come to my house and preemptively beat me up on the case that I might go beat you up again.
I think you're talking apples and oranges here, Keone. I think here's something that here's a group of people that did, a horrible attack on the U.S. And we spent, 20 plus years trying to do something about it. And
Well, not trying. Dave just pointed out several accomplishments in objectives. So it was a little more than trying. There were a lot of accomplishments and strides made in those 20 years. It wasn't just 20 years of farting around in Afghanistan.
And they aren't, I am.
Their control in other countries was greatly reduced and limited from that 20 years that we were in there.
Al
and,
Qaeda,
and
Al
then we
Qaeda-
left and left them back in control again.
Okay, well, we can't stay there forever, Larry.
You're right, we can't. But we should have finished them off and done something about it.
Who?
Well, how do you finish them off?
Right. Yeah, that's you just like
This is the thing. You did finish them off,
Yeah.
and you can't kill everybody who wants to be Taliban because other people will say they're Taliban later.
Yeah, you
I
just
mean,
this
is the problem with the counterinsurgency with this type of war, that it is vexing, to say the least. And it's not like a normal, conventional war where you can destroy the army and then you've won. Those days, that was the 19th, 20th century way.
Yeah, you just line up your armies and annihilate each other, and the winner to the victor goes the spoils. Yeah.
But my point too is that even if you look at Afghanistan, even with all, as far as a deterrent for people doing this kind of thing in the future, it's a pretty big statement. Hey, we will come and we will occupy your country. If you let an organization run free like this. And I think that it probably was an effective deterrent, even though it ended up in a very ugly, unseemly way, and the Taliban have returned to power. The Taliban returned to power because they're better at governing the country than the corrupt people that we had in power. And
right. And then as a deterrent, we said we're going to pack up and leave, and we're going to give you billions of dollars worth of brand new equipment to fight us with.
Fight who with? They can't come over here. So here's the question: name the number of successful terrorist attacks on American soil since 9/11.
Domestic or foreign?
Oh, foreign, Al Qaeda or otherwise.
Well, you got some domestic attacks have happened, but who says that wasn't instigated by foreign terrorists?
No, we got more issues with our own people shooting up schools and grocery stores than we have foreigners coming over here.
And we've had discussions about that too.
Yeah. So I mean, what I'm saying with Dave is 9/11 could have started something. Whereas if there was no offensive after that, who knows what have been happening between 9/11 and now? So.
No, I agree with you. That was the last major event that happened in this country. Yes, and it's a good thing. It is a good thing. And I do believe that we get involved in way too many things in other countries.
Well,
and if we're going to,
there's a reason.
and if we're going to get involved, then we need to go in and do it with both feet and not play around.
It's not really playing. It's a little more nuanced in that. Before I joined the military, I was one of those people. Let's just go over and kick their butt. It's not as simple as that. It's not. It's never going to be as simple as that. And there's a lot of information that we will never be privy to. A lot of information. We're privy to a lot of information, but there's a lot of information that we are not privy to. So that's a whole nother show. We'll have you on, Larry, and we can talk about that.
We won't get the info because Biden's got it locked up in his house someplace. But that is another show.
Well, that's because Trump FedExed it to him. No, I'm not going to do this.
Well, that could be.
So that's a whole nother show.
You're going to have that show without me if this is where we're going with it.
I'm not the show on that. We already had that show, Dave. Not what me and Larry was just joking about. We had the show on U.S. foreign aid, and we talked about Larry, go back and watch that show. We talked about why we get involved.
It wasn't that great.
Because it didn't have a Ukraine update in it. Okay, Dave. We'll retrofit one in there. Let's have you talk in the past, and we'll put it in it. No, but great show today. We went a little long. Love the update, Larry. Thank you for being on the conversation.
I appreciate you having me.
All right, good talking to y'all.
Dave, thank you for being on, and everybody else, enjoy the rest of your week and catch us in 2 weeks. Goodbye.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.